The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 7. The Family and Feminism. Chapter 9. The Meaning of the Sex War. The sex war, which we will now study a little more closely, is destined to free not only women, but men. But it led off, naturally, as a war to free the woman. The woman was the chattel or slave of this terrible little despot, the father of the family. There were millions of such despicable little despots. Their power must be broken. The despot smiled indulgently. He knew he was not much of a despot, he didn't know what all the fuss was about, but concluded that those women had become possessed of some obstinate piece of a logic that they had better be allowed to get on with. Socialism wishes to abolish family life, because it costs too much, was Proudhon's explanation of feminism. And that in one sense must be accepted as the true one, on the economic side. Feminism in that sense was simply the conscription, under a revolutionary egalitarian banner, of an army of women, for the purpose of the attack on and destruction of the home and the family. There is much more in the war on the family than the economic factor. But it is certainly the economic factor that persuades capitalism to favor the feminist movement and urge the conventional socialist to this form of war. Men as a class, the masculine class, have recently had to support a great number of wars all at the same time. The Great War, which was of a traditional type, and yet very novel in its barbarity, the class war, of course, and then a war that was regarded originally as a joke, the sex war. All these wars are wars of freedom, but their ultimate objects are generally misunderstood. When feminism first assumed the proportions of a universal movement, it was popularly regarded as a movement directed to the righting of a little series of political wrongs. Woman had been unjustly treated, had been a chattel to be bought and sold and disposed of. Men were free, women in chains, chained to the hearthstone in the home, which was also referred to as the castle of the male jailer. 1,000 chivalrous gentlemen leapt to arms and rushed to the assistance of this matron in distress. With great gestures of Christian magnanimity, they divested themselves of all traditional masculine authority or masculine advantage of any sort. Tearfully they laid them all at the feet of the dishonored matron, who dried her burning tears, and with a dark glance of withering indignation picked them up and hurried away. The general herd of men smiled with indulgent superiority. So that was all settled. It was a bloodless revolution. Feminism was recognized by the average man as a conflict in which it was impossible for a man, as a chivalrous gentleman, as a respecter of the rights of little nations, like little Belgium, as a highly evolved citizen of a highly civilized community, to refuse the claim of this better half to self-determination. There were spectacular wrongs that had, in all decency, to be righted. The issue was put to him, of course, in a one-sided way. He accepted it as a one-sided thing. Ever since it has continued one-sided, in the sense that, although the wrong has been righted, the man is still in the ashamed position of the brutal usurper and tyrant. He finds his riddle in the sex war something in the nature of the immense conventional figure of the boss in the neighboring class war, although there in the class war his own relay is probably a very humble and far less imposing one. How the sex war links up with the class war, the age war, and the war of the high and the low brow, is as follows. The prevalent dominance of men is a phrase used commonly. Man in himself is a symbol of authority. Masculinity, in a state describable as above, is in itself authoritative and hence arbitrary. The most miserable and feeble specimen of the male class is in that paradoxical position of representing the most devilish despotism and symbolizing brute force. He suffers from the accident that he symbolizes authority in an era of change and militant revolutionary revaluation. So, in the sex department, conterminous with that of administrative political power, or of the masterman relationship in industry or in domestic life, and with the family relation of parent and child, the revolutionary attack would, in its most generalized form, have the character of an attack on man and on masculinity. For, apart from man as father, or man as husband, or man as leader, in tribe or state, there is an even more irreducible way in which man is a symbol of power and domination. Man as man tout court is an anachronism, is unscientific. When Christ said to the rich man, "Give all to the poor and come along with me, barefoot, and I will show you the road to heaven," the rich man usually laughed and went his way. Man, or his political representatives, when recommended to give up all his privileges enjoyed at the expense of woman, did not show this cynical front at all, except a few contumacious figures here and there. He immediately disgorged everything, in a true Christian and chivalrous spirit. He considered himself most amply rewarded with the nice kiss that his generous action earned him. Had someone asked the same man to give all he had to the poor, or to hand over 1,000 pounds of his capital to a distressed friend, he would, like the rich man in the Gospels, have laughed. Yet effectively he was doing the same thing in his sentimental capitulation to the feminist propaganda. This is merely noted as a matter of historical interest. Had men resisted, the struggle would have been more bitter, but would have had the same result. It was very lucky in this particular case that the usual veil of stupidity let down over their eyes obscured the issue, and anyone looking back on these events when the movement is complete, at some future day, will agree that the feminine combatant was even blinder. In the long run both will be the gainers, in being relieved of too much of each other's company, and all the domestic burdens and responsibilities imposed by the family. The nightmare, sex, will not force people into each other's society for life, when a half an hour would answer the purpose. But from the conventional point of view of the moment, certainly the women were the least wise, for according to those standards, they had most to lose. So man gave up his privileges like a lamb, but, needless to say, it is not the rich man, either of the Bible story or of any other story, who is the loser in these or any similar transactions. He gives nothing up quite as in the days of Christ. But man also in this will in the end be a little better off. Prohibition is another case of the same sort. The rich man wishes it, of course, in order to get more work out of the poor man. He does not propose, himself, to knock off drink for the moment, only to make it so expensive that the workman cannot get it. But also, whatever you may think of this one-sided law, the workman will be better without drink. It is true that the rich man immediately sells his workman a crystal set and a cheap motor car, and, so the tester assures us, gets 40% more work out of him. But the workman enjoys using the crystal set as much as the rich man enjoys selling it to him. The object of the capitalo-socialist promoters of the sex war was dual. One object was the quite temporary one of discrediting authority, and reducing this smallest and feeblest of kings, the little father of the family squatting rather miserably in his shabby, uncomfortable little castle, like a king of Alice in Wonderland. But the break-up of this expensive and useless unit, the family, and the releasing of the hordes of idle women, waiting on little kings, for industrial purposes, was the principal object. 10 housewives daily performed in the way of washing, cooking, and so forth, what two could perform under a communal system of the Fourier type, or that being introduced in communist Russia. The remaining 8 would then be available for other forms of work. That is the economic object of the destruction of the idea of the family and the home. Incidentally, it will break up and root out all those little congeries of often ill-assorted beings, and terminate that terrible, age-long tete-a-tete of the husband and wife, chained to each other for life for the practical purpose of perpetuating the species, which could not be effected more successfully without this often unhappy union. In the mind of the most villainous and black-hearted of capitalists, no doubt, it presented itself solely as a problem to get hold of cheap female labor. The hordes of unmarried women would be formed into a third sex like the sterile female workers of the beehive. This could not be done without the displacement of an equal quantity of men. So a sex war would be a good thing. Funds were forthcoming for feminist equipment. Such an attitude did no doubt exist, and does, among a certain type of men. But that does not affect the ultimate utility of the movement, nor is it any reflection on the motives of such a man as Fourier, who recommended a social reorganization on these lines a century ago in his Phalansterian system. If, every time a great man of science, like Faraday, was about to engage on some research, he reflected what terrible uses it might be put to; if, every time an inventive artist was about to engage in some kind of experiment in literature, painting, or music, he grew disgusted at the thought of all the travesties and vulgarizations that must ensue, degrading and caricaturing his invention; or if the social reformer like Fourier were overcome with the thought of what quantities of evil people would exploit and corrupt his dreams of human regeneration, then perhaps all these men would never create. So we should not benefit by that. Whenever we get a good thing, its shadow comes with it, its avid familiar. It is in order to disentangle these things, principally, that this essay has been written. The extreme complexity and intermixture of the good and the bad, in the sense of what is good for people in general and what is bad for them, makes this task a very difficult one. It is the supreme task for the sociologist or philosopher today. But almost anything that can be praised or advocated has been put to some disgusting use. There is no principle, however immaculate, that has not its compromising manipulator. All that must be borne in mind, and the shadow and the reality, the real thing and the imitation, brought forward to some extent together. At all times there have been a host of men who performed a simple work which a woman, or a child for that matter, could undertake equally well. On account of the sex prerogative, and sex privilege, they claimed a wage superior to what a woman would claim for a similar employment. It was for this reason that male privilege had to be broken. Woman's rights was, from the point of view of many of the most influential of its supporters, simply an expedient to reverse this position. The pretentious claims of the white male had to be broken. Now, the sequel of the sex war is in many ways very unpleasant. It must be remembered, however, that the change round is only very partial as yet, and the period of conflict and friction has not ended. Also, it must be remembered that in Western society the destinies of this war are still in the hands of people likely to exploit it for the most evil motives. Let us consider it from this point of view for a moment, as a struggle carried on in the midst of a system bound to exploit it and turn it to its own detestable uses. We observe today that technically women have won their war. Yet, so far, the peace after the sex war is of the same dubious character as the peace after the Great War. Even the victors are a little laughed at by the less delicate of the agents of the great system on which their success reposes. The soldiers, in the same way, were laughed at when, their great war over, they came and showed their mutilated limbs, lost jobs, and broken health to their masters. This cannot be better illustrated than by an article entitled "Is There Really a Sex War?" in a great Sunday newspaper, which devotes a good deal of space to chattily instructing its readers, the soft drilling of the great and docile public, which is the great function of publicity, as to how they should go, and what attitude they should take on great domestic and international questions. The writer of this particular article starts by mocking the feminist and partisan of the sex war as an unsexed, raw-boned, unattractive tribe of female cranks. No wonder, he says, there is a sex war for them. But does any pretty girl think there is such a thing as a sex war? The result of the fact that the female constitution is of sterner stuff than the male, is the well-known surplus of women, roughly 2 million, in this country. There is nothing more curious than the way life adjusts itself to local conditions. Since a large number of women are plainly condemned to sterility by the fact of the surplus, a percentage of the female population automatically and instinctively makes a type that can be seen in large numbers at any university, and with all the plausibility it can command it preaches a career in celibacy for woman, and hatred of man. The sex war of the feminists is a thing of which no woman of average good looks and pleasant temper is ever conscious. No pretty woman ever complained of the hostility of men as a sex. No normal man ever complained of the sex war waged against him by woman. Never was a war so peculiarly carried on as that alleged by the feminists to be incessant between man and woman. These mortal antagonists apparently cannot exist apart. Take any thoroughfare at random. The immensely preponderant proportion of the passers-by are 2 and 2 in the smiling company of a person of the other sex. The unhappy-looking ones are those who are without the company of members of the opposite sex. There the poor disappointed feminist type, claiming her rights, which she had secured in her war, gets it straight and strong. The industrial boss, in the person of his journalistic employee, laughs at her, of course. You poor, hard-featured, unsexed drone, that no man would have, who goes alone down the street, envying all the pretty girls hanging smiling on the arms of their beaux, or, if in company, in the company of another female much like yourself, so you want more money, do you? Well, you won't get it. You have slightly misunderstood the significance of your famous victory. It was a victory for me, not for you. Woman frequently gets the job because, not having another woman and several children to support, she can afford to accept a lower salary than a man. And then, resenting this lower salary, she sometimes talks bitterly about sex discrimination and the sex war. The agitation of the female school teachers for salaries on the male scale, though not quite on the same plane, is a cognate case. The feminists, having obtained practically all they had ever clamored for, now unanimously chorus the slogan, "Equal pay for equal work, whether performed by man or woman." They are pathetically unconscious of the fact that, apart from the teaching profession, were this principle to be enforced, a great percentage of employed women would immediately lose their jobs to men. Since the principle of equal pay is not in force, they raise the old cry of the sex war and point once again to the brutal domination of the unscrupulous male. The harsh fact, however, is that the sex war is between man and woman is a myth. It does not exist. There is, indeed, a sex war always in full swing, a war in which no quarter is given on either side, and that is the sex war between woman and woman. One war, you notice, is guffawed away, and another little one started, or an old one restarted. There is a war, he says in effect, but it is a war between woman and woman. And he recommends them more or less to go and pull each other's hair out, and to forget the sex war. That is over, that has served its purpose. The readers of such an article grin, and, insinuating itself beneath the veil of kindly humor and gossip, the sense slips into their minds and installs itself there. They notice that the writer is a man. If he is impolite about the opposite sex, they giggle and express the opinion that he has probably been jilted. In any case, they regard him as a harmless gossiping personality, supposing him to have the same prejudices and preoccupations as themselves, since it takes a great deal to show to people that others are not invariably just like themselves. A little sex war talk springs up, perhaps between mummy and daddy, to which the children, part of quite another category or class, disdainfully listen, or else attend to something else.